Grayson Pike walked past the woman, cleaning the spotting scopes the way a man walks past a chair. And the worst part was that he wasn't even being cruel. Cruelty would have meant he'd noticed her. He hadn't. He had a camera crew 3 steps behind him and a row of paying clients lined up on the firing point, and his whole body was tuned to the lens, the chin lifted, the voice pitched to carry across the Bellrock range like he was narrating a documentary about himself. He dropped his empty coffee cup on the bench beside Tamsin Whitlock's elbow, missed the bin by a foot, and kept moving. She picked it up. She put it in the bin. She went back to the scopes. The badge clipped to her vest said Whitlock, RSO, Range Safety Officer, the lowest billed body on the property, the person who checked that idiots kept their muzzles downrange and their fingers off triggers, the woman who showed up at 6, swept the brass, logged the ammunition, and went home to a rented half-house outside Birchall with a wood stove and a dog named Moose. Nobody at Bellrock Tactical knew that the woman picking up Pike's coffee cup had, 11 years earlier, made a cold bore shot across 2.5 kilometers of helm and wind that 2 NATO armies had written up, and then quietly buried because the number embarrassed everyone who had ever bragged about a shorter one. Nobody knew because she had never once told them, and she had built the rest of her life specifically so that no one would ever need to. That was the thing about the Bellrock crowd. They sorted people fast and they almost never resorted. Whitlock had been there 14 months, and the file the place had written on her was 3 lines long. Quiet, reliable, keeps the range clean. And she had done absolutely nothing to correct it, because the silence was the point. The silence was the whole architecture of the piece she had spent 6 years trying to build, and it was holding, mostly, the way a wood frame wall holds. You forget it's load-bearing until something leans on it hard. She had come to Northern Ontario for the same reason people had been coming to Northern Ontario for 200 years, which was distance. Distance from the cities. Distance from the men in offices who wanted her to stand at a podium and say words like legacy and capability. Distance from the version of herself that had a number attached to it. She had a marksman's eye that had never once dimmed and a head that did ballistics the way other people hummed songs. Wind, drop, spindrift, the small Coriolis, nudge the earth, gives a bullet that hangs in the air, long enough to feel the planet turning underneath it. And she had decided at 34 that she would simply stop letting anyone watch her use it. She taught new hires how to clean a bore. She corrected nobody's groups out loud. When a client's shots walked left in a crosswind, she would, on a good day, tap the wind flag and say nothing else, and let him figure it out. And she would feel the small private pleasure of a thing known and not announced. Pike was running a long-range fundamentals course that week for a group of men who had paid $4,000 each and a camera crew filming a promo reel, and the men were shooting at steel out past 600 meters and missing, and Pike was explaining the misses with the confidence of someone who has never been responsible for a consequence. He talked about feel. He talked about reading the wind in your bones. Whitlock stood at the back of the line with her hands folded and watched him give the men poetry when what they needed was arithmetic, and she kept her mouth shut because that was the job, and the job was the wall. The only person on the property who looked at her like she might be a person was a kid named Sloane Ferreira, 19, a co-op student from the college in Sudbury, who'd talked her way into a summer placement and who watched everything with a hunger that reminded Whitlock uncomfortably of herself. On the second morning, Ferreira had been struggling to call wind for a client, and Whitlock had crouched up beside her and said, "Very low. Mirage is running flat left to right. That's about an 8. Hold 1/3 of a mil," and the client had hit, and Ferreira had turned and looked at Whitlock with her mouth slightly open, and Whitlock had stood up and walked away before the look could turn into a question. After that, Ferreira watched her constantly. The way you watch a closed door, you're sure has a room behind it. The wall held until the Thursday. The Bellrock range sat on a ridge. That was its whole selling point, a long shoulder of granite and pine that lets you stretch a rifle out to 1,000 meters across a shallow valley with a swamp and a logging road at the bottom and another wooded rise on the far side. On a clear day, you could see 4 kilometers. On the Thursday, it was clear, cold for September, the black flies finally dead. And at 10:40 in the morning, Whitlock heard the first siren come up the county road and felt something old and unwelcome turn over in her chest before her conscious mind had decided anything at all. The OPP cruiser came in fast, and then a second one, and then a black Suburban with the discreet markings of the Tactics and Rescue Unit, and a man got out of the Suburban already on the radio and walked straight to Pike because Pike was the one standing in front of the cameras and looked like he ran the place. His name was Renner, Staff Sergeant Renner, TRU team lead out of the regional detachment, and he was a calm man having a bad morning, and what he said cut through the firing line like cold water. There was a man on the far rise, the wooded one, across the valley maybe 900 meters out from the Bellrock firing point. He had walked out of a house on the logging road 40 minutes ago with a hunting rifle and a girl, his stepdaughter, 17, named Carries, and he had a domestic warrant and a separation order and a bottle and a head full of the specific despair that comes to a man who has lost a mill job, a marriage, and a reason all in the same calendar year. He had taken Carries up the slope to a clearing the locals called the Lookout, and he had sat her down on a stump in the open, and he was holding the rifle, and he had told the negotiator on the phone that at noon he was going to make sure nobody could take her away from him ever again, and the negotiator did not think he was bluffing. The problem, Renner said, and here his calm cracked a hairline, was the ground. TRU couldn't get close. The clearing was open on the valley side and walled with thick spruce everywhere else. Any approach through the trees would crack a branch, and the man had said explicitly that if he heard anyone in the bush, the girl went first. The only clean line of sight to the Lookout, the only angle in the entire township that put eyes, and if it came to it, a rifle on that clearing without crossing 100 meters of open ground, was the Bellrock Ridge. Renner had pulled up the topo on his phone in the cruiser and seen the range marked and made a decision that he was already half regretting, which was to come here, to the long-range school, and ask. He had his own marksman with him, Constable Drew Halverson, TRU's designated shooter, a good steady kid with a precision rifle and a county fair trophy of confidence. Halverson got set up on the firing point in under 3 minutes, prone behind a .308, and he put his scope on the far rise, and Whitlock, standing 20 feet back, unbreathing, doing the problem in her head before anyone had asked her to, watched his face change as the valley told him the truth. 940 meters, Laser said. But that was the easy number. The valley between the two ridges was a wind machine. Cold air was pouring down off the high ground and sliding along the swamp at the bottom and lifting warm off the far slope, and the result was that the wind at the muzzle was one thing. The wind at mid-valley over the water was another thing entirely, and crossing the other way, and the wind on the far rise where the man sat was a third thing again. 3 different winds in one flight path, layered, switching, and a .308 bullet flung across that gap would spend nearly a second and a half in the air, hanging there, getting voted on by every one of them. Halverson had trained on flat ranges with one honest wind. He looked through his scope at the worst shooting problem of his life, with a hostage 3 feet from the target, and his hand started very slightly to shake. "I can't read it," he said. He said it quietly to Renner, but the firing line heard. "The Mirage it's doing 3 things. I put a wind hold on and the flags down low are telling me the opposite. If I'm wrong, I hit the girl." Renner turned to Pike. Everyone turned to Pike, because Pike ran the long-range school. Pike was on the banner out front. Pike had spent the morning talking about reading wind in his bones. The camera, God help it, was still running, and Grayson Pike froze. It wasn't cowardice exactly, and Whitlock, watching, knew the difference because she had seen the real thing in real places. It was overload. It was a man whose entire competence was a performance discovering, in front of a lens, that the gap between the performance and the thing was 940 meters wide. He got down behind Halverson's rifle because the eyes of the world made him get down, and he put his face to the scope, and Whitlock watched his breathing go high and ragged in his upper chest, and she watched him try to do in 30 seconds the integration of 3 wind layers that he had spent his whole career pretending was poetry instead of math, and she watched him fail to even begin. He said, "Okay, the winds, it's pushing, I think we hold," and then he stopped because he had no number, because he had never had a number, because feel is a thing you say when you don't want anyone to ask you to show your work. His hand was on the bolt, and his hand was not moving, and the clock at the bottom of the valley was running toward noon. Tamsin Whitlock looked at the far rise, and she did the only thing she had promised herself she would never do again. She let them see. She did not run. She walked up to the firing point at the unhurried pace of a person who has decided something completely, and the walk itself changed the line, because there is a particular economy to how a certain kind of person moves under pressure, and the men on that range had never seen it before and felt it in their spines anyway. She crouched at Halverson's flag, the little orange ribbon at the muzzle, and she read it. And then she looked at the mid-valley grass moving over the swamp, and the spruce tops on the far rise, and the thin gray thread of wood smoke rising from a chimney 2 kilometers off that told her the upper air better than any flag could. And somewhere behind her eyes, the whole moving problem resolved into a single quiet sum, the way it always had. The way it had at 19 on a range in Gagetown, when an instructor had watched her call a switch nobody else saw and written one word on her file. Rare. Bottom of the valley's running right to left over the water, about a 6, she said. To no one, to the air, to the problem. Up high on his slope it switches back, full value, maybe a 10. They partly cancel through the middle, and then the far one wins at the end. Net push is left, but it's not a left hold. It's a left hold that releases right in the last 100 meters. So if you hold for the average, you miss right by half a meter, which is exactly where the girl is. The line was dead silent. Renner had stopped breathing. Get up, Whitlock said to Pike, and it was not unkind, and it was not a request, and the register of it, low, level, carrying without rising, was the register of someone who had given orders to frighten people in places where the orders were the only thing between them and the dark, and Pike got up off the rifle like the gun was hot. She did not get behind Halverson's 308. She stood instead and looked at Renner and asked one question. What's in the truck? Because she had clocked, walking up, that TRU hadn't brought only the 308. There was a longer case. Renner blinked and then understood her faster than Pike had understood anything all morning, and he said, 338. Lapua, it's zeroed. It's Halverson's backup. It's the right tool, Whitlock said. Bring it. 2 minutes, the longest 2 minutes the range had ever held. Ferreira ran for the case herself, the kid, sprinting flat out across the gravel and back, and she set it down beside Whitlock with her hands shaking and her eyes enormous, and as Whitlock dropped to the mat behind the bigger rifle, Ferreira whispered, just for her, I knew it. I knew there was something. Whitlock didn't answer. She was already gone. Down into the place she went, the cold, clean room at the center of herself, where the noise stopped, and there was only the rifle and the air and the arithmetic and the 17-year-old girl on the stump 900 meters away, who did not know that her odds had just changed. She built her position the way she built everything, without waste. She found the man in the glass. He was sitting now, the rifle across his knees, talking to the girl, to the phone, to himself, his mouth moving, his free hand pressed against his own forehead like he was trying to hold his skull together. Carrie sat very straight on the stump with the particular stillness of a young person who has decided that if she does not move, she will not die. And Whitlock felt that stillness reach across the valley and land in her chest, and she let it, because she had learned long ago that you do not shoot well by feeling nothing. You shoot well by feeling everything and putting it in a drawer for 90 seconds and getting it back out after. Talk to me about the timeline, she said to Renner, eyes never leaving the scope. Negotiators still on with him. He's escalating. Last thing he said 2 minutes ago was that he was done talking. Renner crouched beside her. If you have a shot, I'll have a shot if he stands and clears her. Right now she's in the line behind him. I won't send it with her behind him. Understood. And I'm not aiming center mass. She said it flat, and it was the most important sentence anyone said all day, and the camera caught it. If he stands and turns to her, I take the shoulder of his firing arm. He drops the rifle. He lives. Your people go in. She moved the bolt a half centimeter, seating it, and exhaled. Nobody dies up there today if I can help it. Not even him. Renner looked at the side of her face for 1 second, and something in his own face changed, the recognition one professional gives another across the gap of every rank and unit and bad morning. and he keyed his radio and told his team, low and fast, to be ready to move on the crack. And then they waited, and the waiting was the worst of it, the way the original waiting always is. The valley breathed. The smoke thread bent, and Whitlock watched it bend and adjusted the cold room in her head by the width of it. A raven went over. Somewhere down the county road, a truck changed gears. Tamsin lay in the September sun on a granite ridge in the country she had bled for on 3 continents, and she was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about an 8 that wanted to be a 10 and a hold that had to release in the last 100 meters. And under all of it, way down where she kept the things she didn't look at, she was thinking, be still. Carries, just a little longer, be still. At 11:58, the man stood up. He stood up and he turned toward the girl and he brought the rifle up off his knees, and the negotiator's voice in Renner's earpiece said the words, he's up, and in the same quarter second, the man's body cleared the line, so that there was nothing between Tamsin Whitlock's bullet and his right shoulder except 940 meters of 3 different winds. And she had already done the math. She had done it 40 seconds ago and redone it twice since, and her finger was already taking up the slack. And she sent it. The .338 went off, and the ridge shoved the sound out flat across the valley, and the bullet climbed and fell and lived its whole 2.5 life out there over the swamp, getting voted on by the 6 and the 10 and the switch, holding the left that released right exactly when she'd told it to, and it arrived on the far rise a full beat after the rifle's noise had already faded into the trees. And it took the man through the meat of his right shoulder and spun him a quarter turn and put him down. And the hunting rifle dropped out of his hands into the moss, and Carey's was already running, the stillness broken at last, running downhill into the spruce, where the dark shapes of TRU were suddenly moving out of the tree line they'd crept to under the cover of that crack. For a second, nobody on the Bellrock firing point made a sound. Then Whitlock said, into the radio Renner had instinctively held to her mouth, in that same level register, he's still alive. Tell your medics he's losing a lot of blood from the right shoulder. They need pressure on it before they worry about the cuffs. And a voice on the far rise came back tight and fast confirming, and the whole line let out its breath at once like a single lung, and the camera operator was crying and didn't know it. And Grayson Pike was standing 6 feet behind her with his hand over his mouth and his eyes wide, and absolutely nothing of the man who dropped a coffee cup by her elbow 2 hours before. Down in the valley, when they got the girl, she fought them. Not to get away, but to turn around. Carey's planted her feet and twisted in the grip of a constable twice her size and screamed back up the hill at the man bleeding in the moss. And what she screamed was not what anyone expected. Don't let him die. Please don't let him die. He wasn't always like this. He just, please. And the medics knelt over the man who had nearly killed her and worked to keep him breathing, and Tamsin Whitlock heard the radio relay it across the valley and pressed her forehead, for 1 second, against the cold stock of the rifle, because that was the part that always got her, every time, in every country, not the ones who hated, but the ones who were loved anyway, by people who had every right to stop. She got up off the mat. Her knees were stiff. She was suddenly, comprehensively tired, the deep kind that has nothing to do with sleep. And she handed the rifle back to Halverson butt first, the way you hand a thing back to its owner. And the kid took it with both hands, like it had changed in the last 10 minutes, which it had. That should have been the end of her involvement. She wanted it to be. She had already started to turn away, started to rebuild the wall brick by brick. I'm the range officer. I keep the range clean. When a gray Outback came up the county road and parked at an angle, and a woman got out of it who did not belong to the OPP or the camera crew or anyone else there. She was 60 maybe, small and straight-backed and weathered, in civilian clothes that hung on her the way clothes hang on someone who spent 30 years in a uniform, and she had come because she'd been 40 minutes down the road giving a talk to a Legion branch about the regimental museum. When the call about a TRU mutual aid request had crackled across a scanner some old soldier kept on the bar, and she had heard the location and felt, the way Whitlock had felt the siren, something old turnover. Chief Warrant Officer Esme Trahan, retired, had not seen Tamsin Whitlock in 6 years. She had written the recommendation that the Bellrock office had never read because Whitlock had never submitted it. She had been the senior NCO on a hill in Panjwai on the worst night of both their lives. And she walked across the gravel of the Bellrock range with her eyes already wet and stopped in front of the woman in the RSO vest, and the whole firing line watched a retired chief warrant officer come to attention and hold it. "Master Corporal," Trehan said, and her voice did not quite hold. "You could have at least told them who was sweeping their brass." Tamsin Whitlock looked at her for a long moment. "It's just Whitlock now," she said. "It is not," said Trehan, "and it never was. And that shot was yours. I'd have known it from the next county." And she stopped because the rest of it she couldn't get out, and she didn't need to, because Renner had quietly told his constables, and his constables had quietly told the camera crew, and the camera crew had quietly told the $4,000 clients and the line of men who had spent the morning paying Grayson Pike to teach them how to read wind in their bones. "We're now looking at the cleaning lady, the way you look at a load-bearing wall the instant after something has tried to knock it down and failed." Pike came over last. He came over the way a man crosses a room he isn't sure he's allowed in. He had no performance left in his face. That was the thing Whitlock noticed, the thing she'd watched the morning strip out of him, and what was under the performance turned out to be just a person, scared and humbled and trying. He stood in front of her, and he didn't know what to do with his hands. "I froze," he said. He said it plainly, which cost him everything. "I've been telling people for 6 years that I could make that shot. I got behind the gun and I had nothing, and you—" He stopped. "How did you know I'd freeze?" "I didn't know you'd freeze," Whitlock said, and she said it gently, "because there was no profit in cruelty and there never had been. I knew somebody had to send it, and you weren't going to, and I'd already done the math. That's all it ever is, Pike. Somebody does the math and somebody doesn't, and you find out which one you are about a second and a half before it lands." He took that. He nodded slowly. "The range is going to be different," he said. "After today." "Yeah," she said. "It is." Trehan stayed until the OPP cleared the scene, until the Suburban took the man, alive, stabilized, en route to Sudbury with a constable riding beside him, and until Carey's had been wrapped in a foil blanket and put in the back of a cruiser to be reunited with a mother somewhere down the road. Before she left, she put a hand on Whitlock's arm, and the two of them stood a little apart from the others. And Trehan said the thing she'd driven over to say. "They're standing up a marksmanship cell at the new training center. Real one. Build it from nothing. They've been asking me for a name for 8 months, and I've been telling them the only name worth having quit and disappeared into the bush, and they've been telling me she'd never come back." Trehan looked at her, and the years were in it, the hill and the dark and the long road after. "Come back, Tamsin, on your terms. Slower and harder and done right, which is the only way you've ever done anything. Build it so. The next quiet one nobody notices gets seen there's a girl on a stump." Tamsin Whitlock looked across the valley at the far rise where the medics had knelt, where the girl had screamed, "Don't let him die," where her own bullet had spent its second and a half being voted on by every wind in the township, and arrived exactly where she'd told it to. She thought about the wall she'd built and how it had held for 14 months and how it had cost her, every single day, a small piece of the thing she actually was, traded away for a piece that turned out to be made, mostly of hiding. "Slower and harder and done right," she said. "And nobody films it." "Nobody films it," Trehan agreed. "Then yes." She picked up the case off the mat and carried it back to the Suburban herself, and she said goodbye to Ferreira, who would tell the story for the rest of her life and would, in about 9 years, be the best wind caller in the Canadian Armed Forces, and would always say she'd learned it on a Thursday in September from a woman who swept brass. She nodded to Renner, who nodded back, the whole conversation in it. She did not look at the camera. Then Tamsin Whitlock walked out to her truck in the long northern light, the kind that comes down out of the spruce in the late afternoon and turns the gravel gold, and Moose was waiting in the cab with his nose against the window fogging the glass, and she let him out, and he ran a wide, stupid, happy circle around her legs in the parking lot of a place that would never see her the same way again. She stood for a minute and let the cold come up off the valley and finish what the morning had started. 5 people had needed her today, and one of them had needed her not to miss, and one of them had needed her not to kill, and she had been able, for the first time in 6 years, to be the whole of what she was in a place that required all of it. And the tired she felt was the earned kind, the kind that means the work was real. She had never needed anyone to know her name. She had only ever needed the wind to be read right, and the math to be done, and the shot, when it had to go true. And in every valley she had ever lain above, on every hill, in every country that had asked too much of her, the wind had been read right, and the math had been done, and the shot had gone true, because that was who she was under the brass, and the silence, and the cleaning vest, and no amount of disappearing had ever once made it not so. She put the truck in gear and drove home to the wood stove, and the dog put his head on her knee the whole way, and the next morning she did not go to Bellrock. She went south, toward the new range and the empty cell and the long, slow, honest work of building a thing the right way, and she did not look back at the ridge in the mirror, because she already knew exactly what it looked like, and she had nothing left to prove to it.